Good evening, everyone. I'm Todd Miller, the co-scheduler of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. My co-scheduler, Toby Chapman, is over there to most of your left. So, Toby.
Todd does most of it.
No, it's a joint effort. So we're pleased to welcome you to our April meeting, and very pleased to have David Rullo, who pinch hit at the ninth inning for Ann Belser, who unfortunately because of illness was unable to be with us tonight, but Ann will join us in November, and so there will be information in the newsletter on the website to remind you of her presentation about 7 months from now. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our board member and videographer Audrey Glickman, because it was Audrey who contacted David and asked if he would fill in for Ann Belser. So we're very pleased to have you, David, and Audrey. I'm pleased to give you the floor to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I'm really nervous. Tony, is there something you need me to say to Zoom?
No, I can say if you give me a moment.
Well, here, take a moment now before we introduce them.
All right, I'm just going to speak right into the computer because this is directed mainly, we're going to have a dozen or so people on Zoom watching the program. And I'll remind them that they can't really participate except by posting chat questions, which we will attempt to ask during the participation part of the program. So that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tony. All right, I am honored to introduce Dave Rullo, the author of Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive and the 90s Scene. The book takes a nostalgic look at the hip establishments like the Beehive and the Lava Lounge and the Culture Club and all those places that replaced the Shot and the beer bars in the 90s. Dave is an award-winning journalist, up for another award I just read today. He's a senior writer at the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, and he's also a poet and a musician. My honor to introduce Dave Rullo.
Hi, everybody. I appreciate you having me tonight. So I'm going to start just with a little bit of information about the Beehive. Is everyone here aware of the coffee house? No, that's what I figured. It was the first coffee house in the city that opened in 1991. It was really the first of the 90s generation sort of artistic coffee houses that you would see later on TV on Friends and Frasier and things like that. You know, it was a phenomenon that was taking place across the country. And this was before Starbucks, this was before any of the other sort of national chains that you might see. There were these independent locations that were started by bohemian owners that had some rather odd ideas about what a coffee house could or should be. So there were two owners, both living in Pittsburgh, one from Pittsburgh, Steve Zumoff and Scott. And so Scott grew up here in Squirrel Hill. He lived in the shadow of Forbes Field, and as a kid, he always wanted to be an entrepreneur. So he used to sell frozen ice to people walking into Forbes Field, and then he cut grass, and then he started selling tie-dye t-shirts. And the tie-dye t-shirts were a huge hit. Rock bands used to buy the shirts from him and put their logos on them and sell them at concerts, and they were really, really popular. And that's probably what he would have done, but for the fact that the FTC shut him down because it turned out that the ink that he was using was carcinogenic. So he needed to find a new idea, and one of his distributors in New York had said, you should look at coffee houses. This is going to be a thing. And you know, they're selling coffee for $3 a glass, and I'm telling you this is going to be a thing. And so Scott and Steve were going to California and to see a concert, and so they decided we'll stop and take a look at different coffee houses along the way and just get an idea of what's going on here. So they stopped in Chicago, where Starbucks was opening a second location, and because all of this was new to the consumer, Starbucks had to educate the consumer. So they had these little guides that explained how their coffee drinks were made. And so Scott and Steve took one of those with them, and they went to California, and then on the way back they stopped at a few more places, and then they went to Toronto, and they found a few more coffee houses there that were sort of the aesthetic look that they had been seeking. It was bright colors and really kind of retro looking logos. And I should tell you, by the way, these photos that you're seeing behind me don't have anything to do with this talk. They're just the photos from the book, and they're on a loop. So, if you have any questions about them as I go on, I'm happy to answer for you. But so when they got back to Pittsburgh, they decided this was something that they were interested in doing. And originally they wanted to open it in Oakland. That's where they thought that they would be able to get the most customers because of the universities and because they had gone to the University of Pittsburgh. Turned out they couldn't find a location there, so they looked in the south side, and that's where they were able to find Lando's Pharmacy. Does anybody remember that from the 70s and 80s? It was on East Carson Street. It was the corner of 13th and Carson, and that was the location that they ended up using for the coffee house.
They were there in Oakland for a while. There was that theater.
That's right. That was after.
Well, that was after.
That was after.
Oh.
Yes. So, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had a question. Okay. So when they decided to open a coffee house, there was a woman who moved from Chicago to Pittsburgh, who used to be a manager at Starbucks, and so they hired her. And she taught them how to make all of Starbucks drinks, and that became the Beehive's menu. So if the drinks look familiar to Starbucks, that's why. And so when I was asked to talk tonight, I thought, how do I connect this for the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, right? Like there's got to be something, I thought, a connector. And after thinking about it for a little while, I decided that it was the idea of community, right? What does a community mean, and how do things in the community influence the neighborhoods? And so the Beehive, when it started in 1991, the Southside neighborhood was in fairly bad shape. I mean, it's not like there was rampant crime or anything, but it was headed in that direction. The steel mills had all closed. A lot of the businesses that had been primarily for the neighborhood. No one was coming from Bloomfield or from downtown or anywhere else to go to a grocer on the south side, because they could go to a grocer in their own store or a pharmacy in their own neighborhood. And so the Beehive was sort of the first place that began giving the south side its post-industrial identity, which was an artistic community and eventually a nightlife community, but it definitely started as an artistic community. So across the river, there was Point Park College, there was the Art Institute, there were people staying from the filmmakers at Point Park. So there was a group of people that had been looking for places to go. And up until 91, Pittsburgh didn't have that, right? There wasn't. I went to Point Park College, and outside, once you walked out of the college, there was a Rax, if anybody remembers Rax's, and there was a Subway. And that was kind of it for any sort of activity in downtown Pittsburgh if you were 19 years old. When the Beehive opened in 91, though, it really started opening up what the South Side was going to become. 3 months after the Beehive, Slacker opened next door, which was an alternative clothing store that sold Doc Marten shoes. It was the first place you could get Doc Marten shoes that weren't at a Army Navy surplus store. They sold Andy Warhol's sister made t-shirts, so they had really fashionable t-shirts that you could buy there. But so the South Side slowly started to become what it is. And so that idea of neighborhood, I think, is an important factor in the development of the Beehive. In fact, there's a quote from somebody who ran a circus. It's sort of an alternative circus where people were doing the kind of carny things you used to see on the side of the road in the 1920s. People were sewing their lips shut and belly dancing and swallowing fire. And he had a quote that in the beginning, when they first started, there was this uneasy tension between the residents of the South Side and this new generation of people that were coming in. And so the quote that he had was, "The blue-haired old ladies didn't like the pink-haired young kids that were moving in." And eventually, though, what they found was that the kids who were moving into the South Side were very interested in the neighborhood and in the community and in finding ways to invest their time and resources in that neighborhood. They didn't have any money, so they weren't going to be able to buy storefronts or things like that in the beginning, but they were able to create art, they were able to play music, and that's what happened on the South Side. So from those very humble beginnings, the Beehive, from almost day one, was a hit. Actually, even before day one, word of the Beehive spread on the South Side. The owners, Scott Kramer, I realized I didn't say his name when I first mentioned it, Scott Kramer and Steve Zumoff, when they were decorating their building to get buy-in from the community, they put a sign out front that said "Artists Wanted," just because they wanted people to help decorate the walls. And the next day, there was a line of kids waiting to find out if their work could be on the walls. So they took all the art, they had everyone paint the inside of the walls, and the next day, when they opened, there was a line of people around the building waiting to buy coffee. It was an unbelievable thing. It was readily accepted by the community. And the way they paid people, the artists, were they gave them all tokens for free coffee, right? And the more art you did, the more tokens you got. And so one of the guys who created some of the art walked outside as they were opening the doors on the very first day and gave his token to a homeless man. And he said, "Here, go and get a cup of coffee." So their first customer was someone who didn't have a home. And when Scott said to him, "You know, you're our very first customer," he said, "Wait a minute." And he took back the token and he reached into his pocket and he pulled a ripped dollar bill. You'll see it on the screen. And he said, "If that's the case, then I'm paying for my coffee." And he handed them $1. So from the beginning, they really had a real connection to the community that was on the South Side. Eventually, they got so big that they decided to open a second location. In fact, what Scott told me was, he said, from day one, I thought to myself, we've got to open another one of these. And so they found a location, if you remember King's Court in Oakland, where there were movies. That's the spot that they used for the second location. And it was a much larger space. Scott said the idea was it was about 3 times as large as the South Side location, so we should make 3 times as much money. And he said, and that never happened. He said, we never made any money there until the year we closed. And so, and the reason was rent was so high, it was such a large building, they had so many things going on there. They had movies going on, they had bands playing. Upstairs they had pinball, and there's a real strong pinball connection that I'll talk about in a few minutes with the Beehive. But that became a real stalwart of the Oakland community in the early 90s, even though it didn't stay open as long as the South Side location. It lasted about a decade, and then the owners upped the rent, and they couldn't afford it anymore, so they left But, so you had these two locations. Both locations were catering to this new artistic community, students. They hoped that the Beehive location, or I'm sorry, that the Oakland location would attract workers from the hospital. But what they said were that what the hidden ingredient that they didn't think of was that when doctors and nurses are done working 10-hour shifts, they really don't want to go and drink coffee. They want to go home and go to sleep, right? And so that never panned out for them the way they had originally planned. So this idea of community, though, continued. And as the South Side is redeveloping from this post-industrial morass, what ended up happening was, as you would take warehouses that had been used for industrial things, right, or you had these factories, the people that were going to the Beehive started incorporating them into their artwork. They started either staying at these warehouses, you know, without the owner's approval, or they started to, there's one guy's name is Tim Cullen. He has a pretty famous welding nonprofit in Homestead. Is it Homestead? I think it's Homestead. That that teaches kids how to weld. But when he was starting, he was actually a squatter on the South Side. And what he was trained at the Art Institute, but he wanted to make art, and he wanted to find the cheapest way possible to make it. And so he got a warehouse and just moved into it. And he used to go to the steel mills that were being torn down, and he would take pieces of steel. And he said no one had done this before, right? No one had demolished steel mills, so they didn't really think about safety concerns or things like that. The doors were just open. And so he said, so I would walk in and just grab hunks of steel and walk them back to my place, right? Or he said, if an office was closing down, I would walk up and take their furniture and bring it back to my place. But he said that created problems because next to his place where he was squatting, there was a homeless encampment. He would bring furniture home, he would go back out, they would come over and take the furniture. And so first he tried leaving signs saying, please don't steal my stuff. That of course didn't work. So then he would have to break the furniture before he left each day so that they wouldn't take it and use it in their encampments. So, so there was this very transient sort of art community. There were also people from the brew house space that was, if the brew house was a brewery that had closed, and over the years, late 80s, early 90s, slowly started to become a loft space for artists. But it started as a place where artists were kind of squatting and just living there. And now it is an artistic, almost commune for people who all live there. They pay subsidized rents, I think, and they get credit for creating art. So there was a huge community, the Black Arts Puppet Festival, if you heard of that, in the 90s that operated. It was a puppet festival in the city that continued up until COVID. There were artists there who, despite the humble beginnings of the brew house space, became very famous, who have pieces in the Carnegie's permanent collection or in galleries. So this community that began as, you know, people who were doing work for free coffee, over the years became very, very, very established Pittsburgh artists. Rick Bach and Michael Letourneau were the two people who created the Beehive logo, who created the coffee labels, who did a lot of the artwork for the Beehive. And now their art sells for, I was at a show of Michael's a few weeks ago, and he was selling pieces for like $150,000. So from these very, very humble beginnings, you know, this is what they're doing now. And Rick Bach, he has done all of Mad Mex's, when you go into a Mad Mex, all of that artwork is Rick's. He did the tables, he did everything. So, and then of course musicians, You know, I don't know if everybody remembers the band Rusted Root or not, but they got their start at the Beehive. They didn't play at the Beehive originally. That's where they had all their band meetings. That's where they sold their cassettes. That's where they would eventually play in Oakland and in the basement of the Beehive. So the Beehive really gave the start to a lot of Pittsburgh artists across the disciplines. They also probably single-handedly saved pinball. And that sounds like I'm being facetious, but I'm not. Steve, the co-owner of the Beehive, said that if he was going to own a shop, it was going to be somewhere he wanted to be. And as a kid, he loved playing pinball. So he bought a pinball machine and he put it inside. And it was so popular that they opened up a back room and they brought in like 7 pinball games. And that became so popular that when they opened the Oakland location, they had a room built by an architect that was soundproof so that people could play pinball there all night. And it wouldn't bother the people downstairs who were drinking coffee. It wouldn't bother the people that were in the bar that they had built next door or out in the street. And eventually, there was a place called Broadway Arcade in New York that had been responsible for the Pinball League in the United States. And Steve and another guy bought it from him when he was retiring, and they brought it to Pittsburgh. And so they brought this Pinball League to Pittsburgh, and they had the World Championships the first year at the Beehive in Oakland. And it was so popular, they couldn't fit all the people. So they bought a warehouse in Carnegie, and they filled it. And it became so big that then they had to move it to a hotel in Green Tree and Parkway Center. I think it was a Holiday Inn that was there at the time. But it became too popular for that. Eventually they moved it to the convention center. And it became the 3rd largest convention in the convention center after only the car show and the home show. So that gives you an idea of just how big pinball was under Steve. He really grew it here in the city, and it would have disappeared. It would have probably stayed in Chicago. You'd be able to walk in and find some places. You'd be able to go down south and find some places. But in the Northeast, Steve was really responsible for continuing that here. And so, as the life of the Beehive went on, the focal point that changed everything, there were 2 things that changed everything for the Beehive. The first was around 1996. Out-of-town landlords began developing the South Side because of everything that had happened, because of Scott and Steve, because of Randy, who owned Slacker, because of some of the other people who had owned some of the other places up and down East Carson Street. And Southside Works was developed, and all of a sudden some other night spots started opening that weren't owned by the people living in the neighborhood. And they weren't really concerned about the needs of the neighbors or what the community wanted. They were interested in the cheap rent that had been there after the steel mills closed. So that was the first thing that changed the makeup of the neighborhood. And the second thing that changed for the Beehive specifically was the advent of cell phones and computers. Up until then, this idea of community again, was you would go into the Beehive and you actually had to talk to the people there with you. Everyone had conversations. The place was packed on every day of the week. The place was packed, but especially on the weekends. There were people standing waiting to get tables. There were people in the back who were playing pinball that were talking. So there was this real exchange of ideas that, if somebody was making a movie, they were talking to somebody that was there that was a writer about working on writing the film for them, and there were people in the back that they would discuss, doing music for the films. So you had this really tight collaboration of artists and customers and activity. And after, it's hard to even remember, but probably 97, 98, right, is when the internet started to get larger, get bigger, and get sort of adopted. And so once that happened, people's attitudes changed, and they began not being interested in talking to the person in front of them. They started looking at their computer screens, and Scott and Steve tried to adjust to that. They were one of the first places to become an internet cafe for a while. They sold cards that if you bought the card, you could have X amount of time on the internet through there. The idea didn't really kick off, but they at least tried it. They were really groundbreaking in the fact that they hired women to wire the Beehive and make sure that the technology worked. And they took those women around the South Side to all of the bars and locations, telling people that if you need technology, these are the women to do it. And that just didn't happen. There just weren't women in the technology. There were few, I should say, women working in the field of technology at the time. But Scott and Steve were responsible for that. So you really had this place where the two people that were there were really, really, really interested in the community, right? And really involved in the community. They opened a bar a few blocks down. They opened a restaurant. They would sell artwork from local artists. They were really supportive of the customers, and they allowed the customers to operate in this sort of nebulous field where, one day they're an artist or a band, and if they needed money, Scott and Steve would hire them to be a janitor or work behind the counter and be what they called a coffee slinger, which was, a barista. And then if they had to leave to go do a gig in New York, they would just let them go and hire them when they came back. So they were really community oriented. They were really neighborhood oriented. They were really interested in making sure that the South Side had a base that would take the place of what had been there for the steel mills. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time. Almost half an hour, right? I can keep going. So yeah, I can keep going and going and going in this sort of non-narrative talking, because I interviewed like 75 people for this book, some of them multiple times. I spent a year and a half writing the book. I'm not sure that the Beehive is as interesting to everybody else as it is to me, because it was where I, hung out in college. It was where everybody that I knew was at. If you were going to start the evening, you started at the Beehive, because it was open 24 hours on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. You ended the evening at the Beehive. It was, a magical place. But I'm happy to take questions if people would want to shoot some questions my way. Well, I can keep talking too.
There is a pinball place in Butler,
Yeah.
on Butler Street.
Yes.
In Lawrenceville, Kickback.
That's right.
I looked it up. That was, I've been there.
Yeah.
Done that.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's not just because of Steve anymore, but it's amazing the resurgence of, what amounts to an analog game, right, in this digital world.
Yeah.
And I guess it has something to do with just like vinyl albums have made such a comeback. It's that tactile sort of experience that you can't get through digital games.
How many locations?
There were
did you
two.
get?
There were two. Yeah.
No, I think there was a copycat one in Bloomfield.
There were many copycats. When they started, they were the first.
Okay.
And when I was writing this book, I would, make appointments with people to be interviewed, and every one of them wanted to be interviewed in a coffee house, because that's where they'd gone. And every single neighborhood has a coffee house now, and they're all in some way indebted to the Beehive, whether that's the look, or the drinks, or just the atmosphere. They all took something from what the Beehive had. You walk into the Beehive and there were games in a bookshelf, and a few more feet there were a whole bunch of books that you could take. And now almost every coffee house has those same things. There was artwork that was brightly colored, and the big, cappuccino glasses, right? I mean, how many places you walk into now where the artwork is just a big cappuccino glass? They were the ones that started that. And thankfully, the places throughout now are a lot cleaner than the Beehive was. Yes, sir.
I have 4 adult children, each of whom lived in the South Side for a portion of their young lives. I just texted the group and I told them I was sorry I didn't get them into the Zoom call earlier. And the first comment I get was, I don't have to see it, Dottie, I lived it.
Yeah.
We heard. Okay.
Yeah.
But my daughter commented about both Beehive and Dee's memories that she has. So the community there seemed to move among a number of places.
It definitely did, and the places adapted. The few places that lasted from the time of the steel mills until after, adapted. So Dee's was originally a bar that had catered to the steel mill community, meaning that, you know, they were working in shifts. So you would walk into Dee's, when you went to the left-hand side, there was a salad bar for guys that were coming off the shift and wanted to eat dinner. They could go in at 7 o'clock in the morning, and there would be a salad bar there. When the Beehive opened, it completely changed what Dee's was. Dee's became more of a dive bar. It opened up pool tables upstairs, and it became one of the most popular locations in the South Side. It's still open now, so I mean, it's just had an amazing run.
You said they were, they opened 2 businesses?
Yep.
Restaurants, do you know the names of those?
Yeah, there is a Tiki Lounge, and the second location has changed names. It was, of course, yes, it's Double Y, thank you. And
In addition to the Lava Lounge, of course.
that's right, that's right. And now it has a different name, but they closed it and reopened it, Steve did, and I can't remember the new name. It was originally going to have, I don't know if you saw anything on the news about the big volcano that they were going to have outside that the Southside Historical Society wouldn't let them have, so he had to rethink it, and I think they rethought what the menu was going to be, so I'm not exactly sure what the name of it is right now.
Did they go to other cities for inspiration? Because it seems like sort of a San Francisco vibe.
They did. They went to Chicago, they went to San Francisco, I think they went to Austin, they went to Toronto. In fact, in Toronto there was a bar named the Beehive, and that's where they got the name from. There was also a strip club here in Pittsburgh that was named the Beehive when they opened, and people would call and say, you know, and ask, is Shirley going to be working tonight? And Steve said, and I would say, sure, come on down. Yes, sir.
When I was a teenager in the 50s in Chicago, I discovered, you know, as if I discovered, a black radio station emanating from the South Side. And they would have a regular program from the Beehive, which was a kind of a jazz and blues bar.
Yeah.
And so the name was familiar. What are they doing today, Steve and Scott?
Steve owns the Double Wide, or whatever its name is now, and Scott is trying to decide what his next move is going to be. It may be another coffee house, it may be a restaurant, or he may just enjoy hanging out with his daughter until she gets older.
You know, the chain's making it difficult to
You know,
open
no.
independent?
The funny thing is, I mean, for everyone else, for all the other coffee houses, yes, but they told me Starbucks opened right across the street from them about a decade after they were in existence, and they said it never once got into their business, not once. The people that were loyal to the Beehive were loyal to the Beehive, and that crowd reached far outside of Pittsburgh. Bands like, you know, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, when they would come, would go hang out at the Beehive. Or Al Gore had his picture taken with a mug because of a connection. Al Gore's official photographer used to hang out at the Beehive. So it really had a large following that was very, very loyal and not affected by the chains. And in fact, it was so quirky that you wanted to go to the Beehive. You know, there's a story that the original manager told me that she said when they hired me, Scott gave me this notebook of ideas he had. And, you would think that it would be different types of drinks or cheesecake and things like that, but it wasn't. She said it just had things like cats. And she said, I don't know what cats is. So she said to Scott, what does this mean? And he said, I just thought it would be interesting to somehow incorporate cats into the place. And I asked him about it, and he said, that really does sound like something I would have said back then. So, the way it worked at the Beehive was Scott was sort of the idea guy. He would come in every day with 6, 7 different ideas that they would try, and Steve was the guy that had to try and figure out, how the heck am I going to put together these things that Scott wants me to try this week? And some of them, like pizza bagels, worked really well. And other things, like a sci-fi convention they tried. If you remember, I think it was 96, 94 maybe, was when the big blizzard happened in Pittsburgh. And,
93.
93, okay, yeah. It was that weekend, and nobody showed up, and so they didn't do that again. They did, they had a interesting history with movies, because the people that owned the chains around town had gone to the distributors and said, if you give them first run films, we won't play the films. So Scott and Steve were able to turn that into an advantage. They took films that the first run theaters didn't want, movies like Clerks and Kids, and as Steve said, movies where people stood around and talked a lot. That's what we got. But it really built an identity for the theater. Yes, sir.
I guess if putting my 2 cents in as somebody who went to both locations a lot, I think maybe the thing that differentiated the Beehives from like a Starbucks, you could go into a Starbucks and there's like that interior that like never changes. Where I think one of the beautiful things about the Beehives were that because of this unique collaboration between 2 guys, like perhaps one had a little bit more business sense and the other one was the creative side, both locations never really stayed the same for very long. Like the interior and the murals and everything, but you had like when Slacker left, then the Beehive got the second room, and then the Beehive got the third room, and like they went out and got like these Amish carpenters to make these really big wooden like Amish swingers that were all in there and painted crazy colors. And then as with the Oakland Beehive, the theater became, they yanked all the seats out and it became like the place to go dance to 80s music or to see like somebody like the Jerry Garcia band. And then, the Pollinator went up on the second floor and everybody who was a student in Oakland would go there, and it was like Hemingway's or something. It was like we all knew each other, and there was a little pool table in the corner, and we'd all play like doubles pool, and it was just like this amazing camaraderie, of truly like community. Really, we all knew each other, and there were all those collaborations. So I want to emphasize that flow and change of what it was and what they tried out, or what it could be, or what it used to be. It was, I think, because of all these permutations, in a way, it kind of also made it really special because it never was static, just like a typical other business. It had this like organicism that seemed to kind of follow what the trends were, what the kids of that generation might want to see, and so it was really beautiful in that sense that they sort of listened to us in a sense and changed it like that, and weren't afraid to like change it again, to maybe say, here's what's next, let's try it out.
Right. I think both those points are really well taken. In terms of change, they had a guy named Bob Ziller who doesn't get enough credit in the city for what he did for Pittsburgh art. He owned an art gallery, he owned a publishing company, he was in a band, he was responsible for hanging the artwork in the Beehive that was there, and that changed a lot. and he told me that there wasn't really any qualification for the art other than the fact that it was there, right? Like, I mean, if somebody came in with art, he was willing to give it a shot and see if people liked it. And the other key point from what you said is Scott and Steve were authentic about the experience that they were creating. So when you talk about the Amish swings, they didn't just go to a Kmart and buy, porch swings. They actually got Amish people to make these swings, right? And when they decided to open the Tiki Lounge, they went to Asia and bought actual Tiki artifacts created by, people that's what they did for a living. They didn't just open up a book and get these plaster of Paris sort of Tiki things. They were authentic about the experience they were trying to create. So those are two really good points, I think.
I don't think it would be fair to say what other establishments around Pittsburgh or Squirrel Hill or anywhere are comparable, because there's nothing exactly comparable to the Beehive. But do you see other places that have really tried to have such an intergenerational?
Yeah, I mean, it's so different, right? Like, one of the things about the Beehive, at least in the beginning, was there wasn't any alcohol. So people that didn't want to drink, people that couldn't drink because they were alcoholics, really took to the Beehive. A lot of the places that are open now, that have become sort of these sort of places, do serve alcohol, right? So you have the Squirrel's Cage in Squirrel Hill. That's a pretty popular place that sort of the same kind of vibe. You have Red Hawk Coffee in Sharpsburg and a few other places that I think has really tried to find that vibe as well. I think you can find them. I think it's a lot harder now. And it's not really...
Or other genres like Jerry's Records or something.
Sure, I mean, we could talk for hours about all these different, like the Government Center could probably be one of those places, right? They're selling vinyl records, they have bands there, there's a coffee house inside, and that's really sort of the same sort of experimentation that Scott and Steve were doing at the time. And they're selling artwork as well.
Repeat what that was?
The Government Center. It's on the north side, and they have a second location in Dormont as well.
Why did the Beehive close?
In 2017, the building they were in got bought. They never owned the building. They had a really good relationship with the landlord who had been there, but he was aging out. He sold the building. They were upping the rent, and Scott and Steve just thought, through all these changes, they were open for 28 years. Through all of these changes, they just thought this, it's probably not worth it anymore. So they announced in 2017 they were closing, and it took 4 months for them to close because everyone that had gone to the Beehive started to come back to the Beehive. And they were there every night, and all of a sudden Scott and Steve were selling coffee again. And so they never announced, it took months for them to announce a closing date because they were so afraid that people weren't going to be able to come back. And when they finally did, they had a whole week's worth of activities where original baristas came back, original bands came back. They recorded people's interviews for archives that are now saved at the History Center. The History Center has a whole lot of the original Beehive artwork and furniture and signage that's there, and now they have these interviews as well. So it's really in the fabric of Pittsburgh in the 90s.
Yeah, I'm proud to say I had one of those interviews.
Yeah, me too.
Did you spend money there?
A few bucks.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about Scott and Steve. They used to be able to go in there and for a long time not spend any money, just hang out at the tables. And eventually, Scott was like, "We've got to start charging. Like, you've got to at least buy 1 cup of coffee to be able to be in here for the next 12 hours." So,
Starbucks.
yeah,
Starbucks would kind of
right,
like that.
right. It's also funny. I just want to, because now we pay, in some cases $6 at Starbucks for a cup of coffee, right? When Scott told one of his friends that he was going to open up this coffee house and charge, and I think it was like $2 for the Italian coffee, right? She said, "Good luck to you. You're never going to make money doing that." So it just goes to show you. Anybody else?
Well, thank you, David. We appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us tonight. And you will be selling copies of your book in the back of the room, so everyone please purchase a copy of the book. It's $25, either cash or Cash App or Venmo.
Venmo, yeah.
So,
My wife tells me what it is.
Okay, all right. So please purchase a copy of David's book if you would. And next month, as I mentioned, we're going to have Dr. Matthew Johnson Roberson, the head of the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, which is just in the neighborhood there, in the old Barnes & Noble location, where there was a Starbucks coffee house for a number of years. So I hope you'll join us. That's on Tuesday, May 14th. And then in June 11th, we'll have Lynn McMahon, a local communications consultant who has written a book on the history of Eaton Park. And that was in commemoration of their 75th anniversary, which occurred last year. So we have some fantastic programming coming up over the next several months. You can check out our website for all the details. So anyway, thank you for being here this evening, and look forward to seeing you next month. And again, be sure to purchase a copy of David's book. So thank you, everyone, and good evening. And thank you to everyone on Zoom as well.